Another day, another Trump insider staffing up criminal defense lawyers. Another member of Team Trump facing legal trouble today. It's Trump advisor Boris Epshteyn. He's been arraigned in Arizona for his role in setting up fake slates of electors so that Donald Trump could overturn the will of the people and successfully steal the 2020 presidential election. Trump jokingly refers to him as, quote, my psychiatrist, and a former Trump lawyer who tried to stop the Trump coup plot called him a, quote, idiot, end quote. Whatever you want to call him, Boris Epshteyn is one of 51 Trump allies facing charges for attempting a coup in America. And of course, there's Donald Trump himself, a convicted felon for hiding a plot to interfere in the 2016 election and facing felony charges at the federal and state levels for trying to interfere in the 2020 election. But all that, just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Trump world's criminal culpability. There's criminality literally lurking in every stage of Trump's public life. Trump's former CFO, Alan Weisselberg, is currently in prison for perjury. His former trade advisor, Peter Navarro, is in prison for contempt of Congress. His former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, is facing a 4-month prison sentence for contempt of Congress. His former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, faces felony charges in 2 states, along with his ex-lawyer, Rudy Giuliani. Giuliani is also facing fire from a federal judge who scolded him in court yesterday for his failure to comply with his bankruptcy case. He was forced to file for bankruptcy after a court ordered him to pay $148 million in damages to the 2 Georgia election workers he defamed. We are back with Vaughn, John, Amanda, and Christy. John Hallman, before we went to break, I asked you to think about how we should cover the debate and what you think Trump has planned for the debate, and whether you think there's any chance they'll commit to not inciting violence, another stand back and stand by moment.
Well, I don't think that Trump's going to pre-commit to doing anything, Nicole. And I, because he's Trump, he would claim that he never incited violence to begin with. So it's like it's a really a hollow commitment if he made it. I guess I'd say 3 things. One, the Trump campaign and Donald Trump, despite what we were talking about earlier in the hour about the impact, the electoral impact of the guilty verdict here, they think they're winning this race. Their confidence is not made up. They think they're ahead. And I think from your days in campaigns, if you thought you were ahead and you were managing Donald Trump's campaign, and you were now going to get to this big audience, this big non-cable news audience, not the political junkies, but to the normies out there who don't pay much attention to politics, you would be pleading with Donald Trump, please, just be boring, be dull, don't try to score points. You just need a prevent defense, I'll use a football analogy, or a 4 corners offense to use a basketball analogy. Just look like you're not a lunatic in this race. And I think that if you were running Donald Trump's campaign, you would be thinking about, those I know you have dogs, right? I know you have dogs. You have those little pill pockets. You take the little peanut butter pill pocket. If you have to give your dog a drug, you put the peanut butter wrapped around it. If I were running the Trump campaign, I'd be thinking about a little slug of Thorazine inside one of his hot dogs right before the debate. Because if you could get him to calm down, that would be what you'd want if you were Chris LaCivita. You're not going to probably get that, though. And I think the media question is really important. And our friend George Stephanopoulos is right to say that the first question, employing a little bit of prerogative on the part of all of us from the cheap seats here, Jake Tapper and Dana Bash have a tough job that night. But the first question has to be, who won the 2020 election? And then there's the question that they're going to have a tough job that night doing this thing live with the mute buttons and all that other stuff. The real question, to your point, is what happens after. And I think there are a lot of things you can do to cover this debate. But here's the most important thing that the media at every level has to not do, which is to do that. There's no public event in politics that's more prone to false equivalencies than a debate. It's literally, we write about them and talk about them as if it's a boxing match. And so you look down the chart, you're a boxing judge. It's like, well, Biden scored here and Trump scored there and he threw that punch and he got that jab in and then there was that moment, there was this moment. The media has to apply a value judgment to did Joe Biden stumble a little bit? Did Donald Trump get in a good zinger here or there? Those are irrelevant questions. There have to be people we have to make evaluative judgments about not just how many lies Trump told and fact-checking them, but on the things that matter most. What were the two candidates saying about democracy, about institutions, about the rule of law, and what were they saying they're going to do in the future, and what were they not saying? This is a huge challenge, because the easiest thing in the world is for the media to grade this thing like a prize fight. And it's not a prize fight, because not all punches are created equal, and not all punches land with the same force, and not, no one is probably going to be laying flat out in the ring, but there are going to be things that matter a lot more than other things in this debate, and the media must focus on the things that matter in judging this debate and choosing what to show.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably no more important conversation to have in the next 9 days. So let's have this one instead of anything else we're going to talk about. Amanda Carpenter, say a little more about how this should start and the frame that we should put around. Well, it could end up being the only debate, depending on how it goes for Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I think John is spot on in talking about the things that Donald Trump may want to accomplish. Like, listen, his aides may tell us, like, oh, he's going to be a good boy and stick to a good script and have a robust policy debate. Yeah, I've heard that line before. I don't think Donald Trump is going to go into the script. I think he's going to go in with ideas and things, a couple things he wants to accomplish. Number one, above anything else, because we know this, we've witnessed him over the last few years, he approaches every interaction as an exercise in power dynamics. I win, you lose. I'm strong, you're weak. And I think he's going to go in there with two targets in mind. It's not just President Biden. It is the debate moderators. And I know Jake and Dana are well equipped. They'll do a great job. But Donald Trump is going to go in with that kind of mindset. I have two targets to beat here. And what I think that involves is telling the first big election lie and adhering to it, and that the election was rigged and stolen, as he's pretty much done in every media appearance since January 6th, correct? And then there's the second big lie, which underpins this election, and that the justice system is being unfairly weaponized against him. And then I just think he'll sprinkle on, if we're really preparing for the worst and the most turbulent debate, some stuff about Hunter Biden to try to knock Biden off his game. Because, again, going into this season, Donald Trump only cares about looking as strong as possible against Biden. And this man is more practiced than any presidential candidate in history when it comes to performing on television. I've seen a number of commentators talk about how they think Donald Trump will skip the debate, or he'll be rattled by the fact that there's a lack of a television audience. I don't buy either of those things, because I've seen The Apprentice. I've seen him take over almost every TV interview he's been in when it's just him and an interviewer and no one else but a camera. He knows how to do this. And so if Joe Biden is not preparing for the absolute worst and the torrent of fire hose of lies, and have some kind of a response to support the rule of law, to talk about the convictions with a very clear target in mind of what those responses will be, in a way that he doesn't look rattled, he doesn't look tired, he doesn't look unresponsive, that has to be Joe Biden's goal. I think it's going to be very difficult. I don't toss off this debate at all. And the fact that it's the first one so early in the year, that just gives a longer runway if Donald Trump has that kind of performance to set in that narrative over the summer months.
Vaughn, it's such a good exercise in reminding us of the reality of Trump as a candidate. I mean, the reality is that the way he survived the Access Hollywood tape was by going to the debate, I think it was a day later, and in the eyes of his own campaign and in his mind and in the minds of his supporters and the people who voted for him, somehow managing to turn everything around and get his campaign on offense. Now, I found it appalling and below the belt, but that is a known about Donald Trump. Where does your mind go in thinking of all that is possible about Donald Trump in this debate?
I think jumping off of what you just said, Amanda just said, and what John just said, is the tangents that Donald Trump goes on. Number one, he doesn't like pushback here in the year of 2024, right? It was a bygone era that he enjoyed, quarreling with the media or quarreling with his political opponents. There's a reason he didn't go on the debate stage with the other Republican presidential candidates during the primary. He wanted to avoid being called out for not only his record within the administration, but also the events around January 6th. sick, so he avoided going on the debate stage. And then you look at the fact he hasn't done mainstream TV interviews, and that's clear for the reason he has avoided having to answer direct questions. And that is where the difficulty, I think, is going to be for Joe Biden, because when you're talking about Donald Trump and claims that he makes, a lot of them are unexplainable, right? When he goes and says, right, that war would not have happened with Israel, Hamas wouldn't have attacked Israel if I was in office, or if Russia wouldn't have invaded Ukraine if I was in office. Those are tough things to explain or try to push back on because it takes time, it takes seconds, it takes minutes to understand or explain to the public at large. And this is the reality that Joe Biden is going to have to deal with, because many of the claims that he is going to make about whether it's the economy or employment or black and Latino employment, they're just not rooted in facts. And so Joe Biden is going to have to make the conscious decision of how much does he do explaining to the American public why Donald Trump is making claims that are not real versus trying to make his own point about what a second Biden administration would look like.